Welcome to the MYJO Experience, a podcast designed to help you go further faster and do more with less. Every journey is unique. At MYJO, we celebrate taking my journey, my way. Learn more about MYJO by visiting joinmyjo.com and follow MYJO on all social channels at MYJO XP. Here is our host, Daniel Workman.
Welcome to the MYJO Experience, a podcast designed to help you go further, faster, and do more with less. Every journey is unique, and at MYJO, we celebrate taking my journey, my way. On this episode, we are joined by Ruth Nicholson, a master facilitator. Ruth, welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here.
We are glad to have you, and before we get into what that means, a master facilitator, it's like unlocking the black box for those of us who are not in your world. I'm sure we're gonna find some fascinating things out about what that is. I first want to go back to your upbringing, your childhood. What was life like for you as a kid growing up?
It was an adventure. I was actually born in San Francisco, not far from Haight-Ashbury, and did elementary in the Bay Area during the 60s and 70s, which was a time of turmoil. And when I was 10, we moved home to Texas. Both sides of my family are from Texas. West Texas, that's the panhandle, the square bit that's up between New Mexico and Oklahoma. A much more conservative part of the country than the Bay Area. But I come from a family where a great many of the people in the family either are clergy or they run nonprofits for a living. So very people-oriented family. There are a lot of missionaries in the family, so a multicultural family. My mother and my grandfather were born and raised in mainland China as missionaries.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very people-oriented family. It still is. And so to the hint to the master facilitator thing, working with people and helping them through either getting big projects done or solving really heart-wrenching problems wasn't a profession exactly. It was a survival skill. I grew up with committees and conflict in the living room. And I didn't know that was going to play such a big role in what I ended up doing when I tried to grow up.
Well, we don't like to grow up, but we always like to talk about what I do when I grow up.
Right.
We were talking off air before we started recording, which is our little inside joke for the podcast audience. So in your upbringing, you mentioned clergy, you mentioned nonprofits, you mentioned the fact that your mom and your grandfather growing up overseas. I know this with my own life and, my family, that experience of going abroad and spending time in other countries, experiencing other cultures. Did you have an opportunity yourself to do that? Obviously, San Francisco and West Texas can feel like two different countries, and that's a whole other story for the rest of the world, because a lot of people just don't realize how big and vast and diverse the U.S. is when you think about, well, I traveled through Europe, and we're like, yeah, you haven't left the South yet. Like we've got other time zones throughout the U.S. where the world just feels like two different countries. Did you yourself, as a child, have an opportunity to experience life overseas in other cultures?
As a kid, we did. Canada and Mexico were common. When my brother and I graduated from college the first time, we did do a bit of a tour in Europe with my parents. As a younger person, it was mostly people from other places visiting us. So the intercultural thing was more, they came to our living room. as an adult, in my facilitation work, I've actually worked on every continent except Australia and Antarctica. I haven't figured out how to facilitate penguins yet. Um,
Well, I will volunteer to come help you figure that out. That seems like would be a really fun journey to take
right.
to the other side of the world and talk to animals. So if you can
Yeah,
figure that out, let's
we
bottle
could
it
do
up and share it with the world for sure.
that.
So you mentioned, you went to Canada, you went to Mexico, you took this trip upon graduation to Europe. You had people coming into your home and sharing their worldview and their culture and their life experiences. What kind of influence do you think that had on your way of seeing the world when it came time to go to college and look at adulthood, coming up on 18? Can you think back to that time and think how I know, for example, my son, who spent a lot of time in his teenage years overseas, he sees the world completely differently than most of his peers that he knows, his friends, his friend group, who their world is much smaller, the way that they see the world, their view about how things should be or what could be, the possibility even aspect of life is different versus when you've had these interactions with the greater world beyond your small local kind of growing up scene. So can you think back and think about what impact that had on you and those decisions as you were entering early adulthood?
I think, when I think of my mom, she just was curious. She was curious about all kinds of stuff. She was curious about people. She was curious about the natural world. She was curious. I mean, she was just curious, right? And having people with different experiences, different places they grew up, different professions, different hobbies. Um, I think the thing was realizing there was so much you didn't know and being curious about, well, what does that look like for you, or what is that tradition where you're from? And my mother's favorite question, which can be used in a variety of ways, is how would I know that? How would I know that? And that's part of that's curious, tell me more. And part of that actually regularly challenges your assumption about what am I assuming that you already know? And well, it hadn't happened for a day. I was talking to somebody and there was a misunderstanding. And I stopped, and it wasn't how would I know that? It was how would they know that? I was making an assumption that, well, everybody knows that. Well, guess what? Everybody doesn't know that.
Right.
And so that curious question of how would I know that? And how would I find out, right? Or how would I help you find out? I actually, when I was really little, when we were in San Francisco, actually we moved across the bay to Oakland when I went to elementary school. And my mom and my grandmother were involved in creating the Oakland Museum down by Lake Merritt. And my grandmother was a fine artist, like an award-winning painter. And my mother, the magic of my mother was she just knew how the natural world worked. And the museum was designed at that time to the natural history part of it to go from the Pacific Ocean as a cross section of California between the Pacific Ocean and the state of Nevada. And so all of the different natural parts of California. And she helped design that. And so we would go as little kids and try not to get into too much trouble. And I'm like, how could she know that much about the natural world? And so we moved to Texas. I graduate from high school. She says, what do you want to study? I'm like, I want to be a forester. I want to study forest science. She says, sweetheart, we're in West Texas. It is flat as your desk. There's very little surface water, and there are no native trees. Are you nuts? Well, okay, we know the answer to that. So I get a scholarship. I moved to Seattle, Washington to go to the University of Washington to study forest science because I'm curious. And I had taken a lot of French in school. Um, and I'm like, I want to do forestry stuff in France. That just sounded like the best thing in the world to do. And halfway through forestry school, it all came crashing down. Because remember, I told you there aren't a lot of trees in West Texas.
That's true.
Turns out I was allergic to deciduous trees.
Oh, wow.
Now, there are a lot of conifers up here, but there's some deciduous trees. And so being in the field when I was in school was actually really hard. It was like hard to breathe.
Mm.
But, I mean, why should that stop you, right? And that actually pivoted what I ended up doing later as a facilitator. It's like, well, I can still work in the field. It's just I can't work in the woods as often.
Right.
Not if I want to breathe.
So if you're in school, you have this epiphany forced on you, right?
Yes.
You don't know before you get there. My passion is this. This is what I'm going to do. I think I've got it figured out. And then wham, here's a little side note for you. That's not going to work. So in that moment, were you leaning towards, okay, what do I do next? Or where do I pivot? You know, like the famous episode of Friends where they're trying to get the couch up the stairs. Pivot. You know, is it pivot, or is the mentality press through? What way did you choose at first, and why do you think you went that direction? Pivot or push through?
I actually pushed through because I was halfway through the program, and it's like, okay, you're swimming across the English Channel. You get to the halfway point. Do you give up or do you go to France? And it's like, no, I'm going to finish my degree. And I did pivot a little bit. I went more into planning and environmental law as opposed to field forestry. So yeah, a little bit of pivot, mostly power through. But I got my degree, and the economy was really bad in those years. The forest industry, they were laying people off who had 30 years of experience. And here comes this, hotshot kid thinking, I'm going to get a job. Yeah, right. So I immediately went into grad school. I still had enough saved that I could do that. I'm like, okay, we'll stall. The economy can't be bad forever. And got a master's in public administration, which it's like an MBA, except for it's for government and nonprofits. It's kind of the same concept.
So in the same world that you were familiar with, your upbringing with missionaries and nonprofits and all and the clergy and all that. Fascinating. So you go through grad school. In grad school, what are you thinking? Are you thinking I'm going to end up being this master facilitator, or what was kind of your thoughts about how life was going to go? What kind of profession were you looking or aiming for with that master's degree?
I was still pretty lost. There were a couple of courses in organization development, and working with people, a little bit of facilitation that were really intriguing, but I didn't know how to put that into practice. I didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
And actually the folks at that time in those schools at the university were not that big a help in terms of job hunting. I kind of had to bumble through that myself. And I had an internship with a county government working in economic development. I had an internship, well, it wasn't an internship, it actually was a real job, with the soccer, the semi-pro soccer team that replaced the Seattle Sounders. So when the NASL Sounders folded, there was a team in Seattle called FC Seattle. And they played at one of the high school stadiums out at Seattle Center. And I ran the volunteer program and I ran the stadium. Back in the days when the current Sounders coach was trying to break in as a player, as a pro player. So I had 88 volunteers. We ran the stadium on 88 volunteers and 5 paid staff. And 98% of my volunteers came back. I'm like, oh, well, okay. Maybe I could work with people. They're not quitting in droves, right? They're coming back. So it took probably 5 years before I landed a job with Weyerhaeuser, thinking I really want to work in forestry. But I had this soccer gig on the side, which was paying the rent, and was really enjoyable. I had played soccer in West Texas as a kid. After Title IX passed, they didn't want little girls to play for quite a while.
Right.
So yeah, it took a while to get into Weyerhaeuser, and then there were 2 more whammies to come.
So in the process of taking that job with FC Seattle, and we kind of see the same common thread of people,
Mm-hmm.
working with people in that background. I think I've seen this in my own life with my background and my upbringing. There are certain things that when you experience them over and over as a kid, that become more natural. It may not even be that you're more gifted, like a Michael Jordan that seems to have just fallen out of the basketball sky, like it's actually all of the stuff that we don't see behind the scenes that make it, that give us those myths of this Hercules fell out of the sky and now it's like otherworldly. It's actually all this hard work. It's the culture. It's the family. And in that job, having volunteers, having run volunteer organizations myself, that's impressive to have. I mean, you mention it, I get it. I just want the audience to understand, to have that many people return, not as fans, not as spectators, not as a ticket purchaser, but as a volunteer is insanely good. Like, that is incredible. And so that upbringing, what I'm seeing in your story is that culture and family and that ability to work with people starting to pay off and building in your early career. Did you have any setbacks along the way during that time that made you face that same choice of pivot or push through?
Oh yeah. So the funny thing was, it was a forester friend of mine, a mentor of mine, who got me the soccer job.
Okay.
Which was funny. He ran the press box. But I went to Weyerhaeuser and I thought I'd landed, right? Weyerhaeuser's a fairly well-known forest company, right? We had a controversy up here in the Pacific Northwest in those years, so late 80s, early 90s, about the northern spotted owl. Lived in the woods, ended up on the endangered species on the threatened list. So the big conundrum up here was, how do you manage the woods with an endangered or threatened species in it? Well, the industry, being a little more conservative than other places, pared back its workforce because it's reading it, the tea leaves, and saying this could be tough, right? There were 2 of us in my department. We did kind of the same thing. He had 30 years experience. I had not even 30 months experience, right? So guess who gets laid off? So I lasted about 2 years. I had I had a network And I went to one of my network and I said, I'm looking for work again. And I really don't want to leave land management. I really love this. And he says, well, come work for me. Well, so I ended up with a job with the U.S. Forest Service. So I've gone from private industry to government, and did some absolutely amazing things in terms of land use and roads and mining claims inside wilderness areas, and it was just lovely. And that bird was still in the woods, and we were still struggling with how do you manage the woods with a spotted owl in it. And I got laid off again. 2 years, that forest, we lost a quarter of our employees in 6 months. So the transition and the disruption was very real. And I'm getting a little bit worried about, can I hold a job? Well, there were a lot going on. Well, in the federal system, when you're on the layoff list, they really don't want to lay you off. They want to find you a place. And they found me a place with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So now I've gone from corporate to an agency that actively manages land to an agency that regulates all of the above. And they reassigned me back to the forest that had just laid me off to help regulate how you do endangered species stuff. And that was a little weird. The meeting I showed up at was even weirder, and it didn't go very well. It was really not a good meeting. And the forest supervisor who had laid me off said, Ruth, do something. I don't know. What would my mother do? What would my grandmother do? Okay. Well, I think that's what I did. I don't actually remember. But the meeting was less bad. So this guy who just laid me off went back to EPA and said, I don't want her as my regulator. I want her as my facilitator. And they pulled my regulator job and they gave me the facilitator job. And I became the accidental facilitator because I understood the technical. I had a degree in forestry and had a master's with environmental policy specialty. And I'd worked that ground. I mean, I knew the land, literally. And now I was the facilitator, the referee, the mediator for a bunch of people who literally were trying to figure out, how do you manage the woods with an endangered species in it?
So what kind of people are around the table at those kinds
At those meetings?
Yeah, like obviously you're talking EPA, you're talking about the Forestry Service. Are there private parties there as well, all trying to figure this out, or is this mainly, what kind of meetings are you facilitating?
So imagine that there are 35 people in a room, give or take 30, 35. You have the environmental groups that had filed lawsuits, federal lawsuits about, you need to figure this out. And they are enjoining every timber sale coming down as it comes up. So it's like, well, if we don't like what you do, we're just going to go to the judge. You have people from small communities where there are mills, where the job base is largely timber dependent. So if you're not cutting trees, they don't have a job. They don't have a way to feed their family. You have government folks who are responsible for air, water, those sorts. You've got the regulators in there. You've got the federal agencies who they're Congress said part of the reason I created you was to cut trees. So they're trying to figure out how to do what they're supposed to do, given that if they choose this way, these folks, don't have any work. And if they choose this way, well, they're going to end up back in court. So it's a wide variety of interests, and they're all living. This is a fascinating part. They're all living at different levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Are you familiar with Maslow?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So you've got folks who are worried about feeding their families. And you've got folks who maybe aren't as worried about feeding their families, but they are passionate about a cause in terms of biodiversity and forest health and but they're not afraid to lose their jobs. And so they're talking past each other, and they are equally as passionate. And yeah, that's how I learned.
So
That's how I thought I learned how to facilitate.
so in that moment, are you thinking back to the there's a classic Bible story where there's two women claiming the baby, and to try to figure out who the real mom is, the person says, "Well, I'll just cut it in half, and you can have half, and you can have half," and the birth mother was like, "No, give her the baby," and the one who was not the birth mother but claiming to be the mother was like, "Give me my half,
Right.
I'll take my half," and that's how they figured out who the birth mother actually was that she didn't want her baby to die, and she was like, "Just give her. I would rather her live than or the baby live than me get half." So were you trying to figure out how to divide the baby in those meetings in those early days, and with that, what were some of the lessons you learned early on in facilitating what seems to be, from my standpoint, with no background in forestry, no background in the ability to facilitate on that level, what were the lessons that you were learning with what seems to be a very complex matrix of outcomes and decisions, and every choice has consequences, and consequences don't necessarily mean they're good, they don't necessarily mean they're bad. It just means if I choose door A, this comes with door A, if I choose door B, etc. So what were some of the lessons that you learned and successes that you were able to achieve through some of those early negotiations?
Lesson one is you will never know as much as you want to know. There will always be, I wish I knew this, I wish I understood that. And you still have to make decisions. Even saying, I'm just not going to make a decision is actually a decision, right? So managing the risk of not knowing as much is always there, and the fear around not knowing everything. But the two really big bazongas, one was purpose. A couple, the early meetings, they weren't that good. And I remember sitting down, I had a co-facilitator from the Forest Service and the forest supervisor, and we were trying to figure out how to make these meetings better because they were hard. And so we started with purpose. It's like, okay. And we said, hey, when you want your wildlife biologist to handle, this topic in the meeting, what do you want that person to do? What do you want your road person to do? What do you want your forester to do? And the boss could say, the purpose of this is that, and this is what I want. And it was very clear. And we still had half of the agenda to do. And fortunately, he came up with this, and I didn't have to say it because I was really nervous. I'm like, I'm going to get fired again. He says, wait a minute, half of this agenda is me. Okay, yeah, that's true. And I'm not clear on my purpose. Well, trying to have a good meeting, if you're not clear about why the purpose of the meeting or the purpose of the agenda item, is going to make it a lot harder.
Sure.
And he realized, and we realized kind of together, that when we craft an agenda, there's a purpose of the meeting, and you can use this in your meeting this week, right? There's a purpose of the meeting, but there's a purpose for everything on that agenda. And the clearer you are about what you need to accomplish. I need to come up with a list of places for dinner. I need to make a decision about who to hire. I need to brainstorm ideas for a new fundraiser. The clearer you are about your purpose, the better that meeting's going to be and the faster you're going to get your work done. Because if you're not clear about purpose, you're just going to get frustrated.
For sure. I was watching the other day a conversation between two professional, very accomplished Nashville songwriters.
Ooh.
And they were talking about, it was a fascinating conversation, and they were talking about songwriting and of any place in the world where the songwriter is valued, it's Nashville. That's more than LA, that's more than New York, that's more than really any other musical hotspot in the world. Nashville is known as that songwriter. It celebrates the songwriter, and so when you hear songs come out of Nashville, oftentimes it's multiple people, facilitating a song. It may not be a meeting, but it's a song. And the reason why I bring this up, it came to mind when you were talking about this, because I found this to be really fascinating. They were talking about ego, and that they were talking about some mistakes that songwriters make in writing songs, and it's in the collaboration of creating a song. And one of the guys pointed out that oftentimes there's a breakdown with ego where someone in the room, so let's say there's 4 people that are trying to co-write the next big hit, and one of the people in the room wants to make sure that they have more credit for more lines of lyrics in the song than anyone else. So let's say there's, between your verses and your choruses and any other parts of the song that are written, let's say there's 30 lines. They want to make sure that they've got more than anyone else credit. It's just an ego thing. Like, I want to make sure I leave my stamp on this song. And their point was, the best songwriting happens when we place the priority on creating a great song, not on my part of the song. So if we keep the song the main thing, if we keep the creation of, like, our purpose in this room is to create a great song. Mm-hmm. And if you only write one line of the song, but it makes the song better, and someone else may have written 29 other lines, but that one line made it complete, then great, because now we've got a great song. And it goes for the musicians in the room who are writing the chords, and whoever might be writing melody lines, and what is actually, the lyrics are being sung to, those notes. But they were just talking about all of these different pieces working together, but holding at the top, the priority is, can we create a great song? And let's make that what we judge our success on, not how many chords did I contribute to the song, how many lyrics did I write, did I write the main part of the chorus, etc. So in your meetings, I'm hearing the same kind of ideas percolate about priority and purpose. As you began that career of facilitating, which was this evolution, part pushing through, but also at the same time pushing through and kind of pivoting into this newfound career, and learning about this idea of first principles and priority, etc. How did that shape you going forward in your career, and how did it make it easier to facilitate meetings? Did it, how did that kind of contribute to your next steps?
Yeah, it's funny. I point to that meeting with the forest supervisor and my co-facilitator, because that really, it turned out to be a turning point for me in terms of understanding why purpose is such a big deal in the big way and in the small way. And I'm a graphic facilitator, a visual facilitator, and which means I doodle on flip charts. Like, I use color and pictures and to draw people together. And the graphic I have is based on the word why. And part of the skill of facilitators is asking questions, because you're not an arbitrator, you're not a judge, you're not the person that's going to give them the answer. it's really important to be the neutral person in the room. Because if you're playing agenda, that's going to make it worse. But the question why is such a wonderful question, because the W stands for what, or purpose. The purpose of the meeting, the purpose of your organization, the purpose of everything on an agenda. The H is the how. How are you going to do it? And you know what? There's only 3 things you do in a meeting, really. You gather information or you share information, thinking about updates, presentations, stuff like that. You analyze and make sense of information. What did the survey mean? When we made that decision, what happened? Sort of making sense of the information that you have. And then the third thing is you make decisions. And that could be making recommendations to a decision maker, or it could be making a decision for your group. And so the magic of matching your purpose to what are you going to do. So if I need to come up with a list of possibilities, that's a different purpose and an action than if I need to choose a place to go to dinner. I still may make a list of possibilities, but if I stop at the list, I don't pick a place for dinner, right? And then we're hungry. And the power of the word why, it's this tiny little word, right? I can see an elementary school from my house. Like it's less than a block away. And they have a peace table in every room of the elementary school. And so if you're a student and you have a problem, you can go to an adult and they'll help you, or you can go to a 5th grader. Because they train between 3rd grade and 5th graders, they train the kids to be mediators. They train them to help solve problems. And so when I go into 3rd grade classrooms, we're going to teach 3rd graders how to be mediator, and we're going to teach them with one word. So I walk in with one orange, and I get 2 kids to help me. They're in on it. And I say, whoa, I've got 1 orange. What am I going to do? And the 2 kids say, I want it. And I look at the class, and I say, I got 1 orange, 2 kids. What do they tell me to do?
Split the orange.
Right? Cut it in half. Logical thing to do. And on cue, my 2 co-conspirators don't like that idea. Like, they really don't like that idea. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? The obvious solution is not so obvious. And you let the kids wrestle with the silence. I go, what do I do now? Help me. What do I do? And you can feel the tension. We don't like silence. Right? And finally, somebody will say, why do they want the orange? The powerful word, right? I say, ask the little girl, why would you like the orange? And she says, I'm really hungry. I want the whole orange. And you go, yeah, that makes sense. And you turn to the little boy and you say, why do you want the orange? He says, it's my mom's birthday. And she likes orange frosting on her cake. I want the zest off the orange to make my mom's birthday cake. And all of a sudden, a simple question has opened up more possibilities. Now, when I work in nuclear waste cleanup or reuse for military bases or other things that sound pretty intransigent, asking people why. Why is this important to you? It's not a judgment about, is it good enough? It's important to you because it's important to you. Help us understand what that is. And now you get into your music example, I want to contribute lyrics. I want to contribute a chord progression. I want to contribute, but the point is we want to make sure we, use this orange well. We want to have a good song. One of the groups that I worked with the longest was working in nuclear waste cleanup over at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. And those groups, sometimes they were 100 people from all walks of life. And the history of nuclear weapons in this country and how you clean up from making them is kind of complex. But when they'd get lost in the technical or lost in the politics or just mad at each other, they were one of the most powerful groups I've ever worked with because they had a shared purpose. Nobody in that room, government, private industry, nonprofit, regular citizen, nobody believed the cleanup was done. So when we get lost, we could always pull back to the common purpose, which was we want this place cleaned up and we want it safe. And having that touchstone, regardless of what kind of topic you're working on, is so incredibly powerful. Purpose and being able to ask why in a curious fashion, not in an accusatory fashion.
And the why, you said the what is the purpose,
Mm-hmm.
H is the how, and the why is what?
The why is the people. It's you or who.
You or who.
Right? You
Gotcha.
or it's not quite as clean as the W and the A.
I like it though. That makes sense.
But in any meeting, okay, you can see the people in the meeting usually, right? You know who they are. But
Right.
there are two other groups. There are three groups in a meeting. They're the people who have contributed information and ideas to the meeting that maybe don't show up at the meeting, right? They prepared a report. They ran a survey. They passed you a note as you went into the meeting room. There are people who are contributing to that meeting who aren't physically in that meeting.
Right.
And there are people who will be affected by that meeting who aren't in that meeting. And so making sure that at some level, somebody's worrying about the people who aren't in the room. Because meetings aren't usually done as an island with no effect.
Right. So in this line of work, obviously you've gleaned a lot of lessons. You shared your acronym, the why framework, which I love, and talked about purpose and how that guides you. What are some things that, looking at your career and looking at your work, whether it was early on with the forestry or the soccer or later in the facilitating, what are some things or a thing that you wish you would have known earlier?
I think I wish I had understood that communications, that asking the why isn't something that we all come equipped with. I grew up in a household where most of the adults in my world modeled working with people collaboratively to get stuff done. Whether it was, helping solve a family problem or, in an organizational setting, but there was a premium placed on communicating and helping people work together. And I didn't understand until I was in my mid-30s maybe. Someone said, well, you could be a good facilitator. And somebody else said, well, actually, you kind of are. Well, I'd never had a facilitation course. Heck, I could hardly spell facilitation. I said, I just do what my mother would do when, somebody loses their temper. And they sent me to a bunch of training stuff. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there are words for this. There are theories for this. I just do what my mother taught me to do. So what I learned as a survival skill isn't common. And so if I would walk into a group and I'm like, why the heck don't they know how to do this? In other words, why do they need me in the first place? It's because I'm not persuaded that we, almost adult people, are doing a great job of helping our youngsters learn how to do that, how to have a tough conversation. Heck, how to have a conversation that it doesn't involve my smartphone, right? Sit down and have a conversation, share ideas, be okay if it's something that we don't have to agree on. We're going to a Chinese restaurant. You want shrimp? I want chicken. We don't have to agree. We do if it's Thanksgiving dinner. We're probably only going to cook one of those.
Right, right.
But how do we help the people that we work with, that we live near, neighbors and friends, do a better job of communicating and not assuming they have that skill? And it's okay to ask the word why. It's okay to ask, tell me more. How would they know that? Right? I wish I had understood better that not everybody knows how to do that. And so having compassion around that to help them have those communications is really important, whether it's talking to your neighbor or whether it's talking to somebody at work.
How would you define success, in a meeting, or success in a facilitation, in a an argument? We can take it into a more informal setting. For the audience, they're probably not walking into a meeting with the EPA tomorrow to figure out how to save the spotted owl and what trees they can or cannot cut down or harvest, or et cetera. But they probably are trying to figure out, what do we do, in this situation with my kid and his school and his grades, or do we move to this city for this job or not, or where are we going for dinner, can even result in the need for mediation at times. My little side tip for anyone, if you're up for some spontaneity, just pick a couple places you think you would want to do, and then flip a coin, and just let chance make the decision. Sometimes we'll kind of when it comes to food, we'll come down to, we don't want to eat everything, but there might be 2 or 3 things that we would consider eating. And I just got to the point where I'm just like, hey, I'll just flip a coin, and if it says heads, we'll go here. If it's tails, we'll go here, as long as we're okay with agreeing on a wider set of parameters of where we're going to eat, rather than just the one place we're going to go eat. And so I'll do that on occasion. I've even done that for vacations and other things, where it's like, we don't have to even force agreement. Well, let's just, do we agree to these parameters of how we're going to get the final decision? So in your case, how would you define a successful outcome of a mediation, whether it's informal or formal?
There's a short answer and a longer answer. The short answer is really bad if you're in consulting and you like to market, like to get future work, because the best meetings are when people actually do come to agreement and they're excited about it. Have you been in a meeting where the meeting ends and everybody is drained and they kind of drag out the door and you go, okay, well, we survived, as opposed to the meeting where people came together, they created something, they made a decision, and as they're walking out the door, the energy says, did you see what we did? Right? And you can feel the difference. The tricky bit about that is, if it's really good, they won't say, did you see what we did? And Ruth was our facilitator. No. If it's really good, they won't know you were in there. It's like being a really good referee. And people remember the game, but they don't remember the referee, right?
Right, 100%.
The longer version, I think, is rooted in how I think about consensus. And you are onto something. Knowing how you're going to decide before you decide is really important. Because if you're making up how you're deciding in the middle of the thing, people can feel cheated. Oh, well, you changed the rules partway between, right? That doesn't feel fair. And we have this need for it to feel fair and for us to feel heard. And sometimes you don't have to win exactly, but if it's fair and you feel heard, you can roll with it easier. So with my groups, I ask them, what is your definition of consensus? Because we got to know that before we get into this too deep. And there are 3 parts. One is, I understand the proposal. I understand what we're trying to do, right? If you don't understand what you're trying to do, the rest doesn't matter. So it's clear we want to pick a place for dinner. The second is I can live with the decision. Now, if you imagine a spectrum from over my dead body, I am going to fight you to my last breath, and everything to the other side of that is, I guess I could live with it, to this is the best thing since coffee ice cream, right? So you've got this wide range of agreement, a little bit of agreement to like absolute enthusiasm, but it's not, I'm going to fight you over my dead body. So the agreement part is I can live with it. And it's okay if your I can live with it has a different energy than mine, right?
Right.
Because we're
Right.
still in the I can live with it place.
For sure.
But the third part is the magic. It's I'll support it. It's not I'm going to give lip service in this meeting and I can live with it and I'm not as crazy about it as Daniel is. No. The test is when I walk out, am I going to badmouth the decision or the people or the process or the no. The magic is I'm going to support it. Even if it wasn't my favorite option. But I'm going to support it. I understand it. I can live with it. I can support it. And maybe part of I can support it is, well, next time we'll get to go for Italian. Right?
I've used that card before.
Yeah.
I don't really want to do Mexican today. Can we do it tomorrow? You know, like
Right.
that kind of thing. For sure.
And that's okay.
You know, our family is a little. My wife and my oldest son are less picky eaters. You know, we have a spectrum, and I would probably say my oldest son is probably the furthest into I'll eat pretty much anything. And then my wife is not far behind. She'll eat most things. And she has, in the course of our relationship, pulled me much further to her side of the dietary spectrum. My youngest son is me at that age, where it was like I have a finite menu of a handful of things, and it's going to take me a while to expand my palate, let's say. So we do have some challenges from time to time about figuring out what we're going to have for dinner. And like I said, I found the coin toss to be one of the frameworks to get to a decision. And then, as you pointed out, the idea of, okay, well, maybe not this time, but maybe next time we'll do this, etc., as another way to kind of create consensus and an agreement, so that we don't all kill each other in the car. It helps. So for sure. Well, if you could leave the audience with one piece of advice, maybe they're in a difficult situation. They're trying to figure out, like, I don't really know how to overcome this situation, and I've got to talk it through with someone, but I don't know how to get there. I don't know, maybe it's a first step in that process. Maybe it's, a difficult conversation about, where do we go from here? They're facing a business decision and they don't know, do I push through? Do I pivot? As we've talked about throughout this episode. If you could leave the audience with kind of one final thought, one piece of advice, what would you have to kind of help people facilitate some, choices that as we've acknowledged, every choice has a consequence. But could you give us something that would give maybe useful, helpful to someone in a situation where they're trying to figure out a way forward?
So I would take two parts, and you start with yourself. And there's a technique, and it's probably got a fancy name. I just think of I have a 5-year-old grandson. And for those who have small children in their world, what is their favorite question? It's back to why.
Yep.
So when someone asks a series of why questions, think about when your kids were little and they'd say, why do I have to eat my broccoli for dinner? Right? And, well, your mother cooked broccoli for dinner. Well, why? Well, she wanted to create a
To
balanced
torture me.
meal.
I'm sorry.
Well,
I
why?
won't
Right?
interrupt you.
So every time you ask why, you go a little deeper, right?
Sure.
So, okay, it's okay to pretend you can borrow my 5-year-old grandson. And what happens is every time you go deeper, you're discovering more information, something that's important to you, some more aspects. So if you're in a tricky situation, in a difficult situation, ask yourself that. If you go about 5 times, it's called the 5 whys. You run that 4 or 5 times with yourself, you're going to start getting into, why is it important that I contributed a melody? Why is it important that I have broccoli? Why is this issue so important to me? Is it self-respect? Is it I'm worried about my income? Is it I'm worried about my kids? Whatever it is. So when you're clear on your why is this important to me? Or even it's important to me because I'm afraid of this thing happening. And being able to identify that, oh, that's why this is important. Because I'm actually afraid of something. Then when you're meeting with the person that you have to work stuff out with, find ways to ask them why as well. Because you're not seeking to impose your thing on them off the bat. That's probably not going to go over very well. But if you're going, I want to understand why this is important to me. So tell me more. What does that look like? I want to understand. So you keep your why in that realm, not why do you think that nutty thing? Like, don't ask it that way. But if you ask your partner, your colleague, then you're going to understand better what is important to them. And sometimes there's a way to solve what's important to you and what's important to me at the same time. Remember that orange. Cutting it in half wasn't the best idea.
For sure.
But we had to understand why it was important to those 2 kids. But before you can have a great conversation with the neighbor, you got to understand what's important to you. And then hopefully having the courage to say, well, it's really important to me that this not happen. I'm worried about that. And they just might step up and help you out.
That's good. That is so good. Well, Ruth, thank you for joining us on this episode. Where can people connect with you or learn more about your work and your background, and maybe even get some help from you to mediate and facilitate some of their situations that need to be resolved? Where could they connect with you?
I've got a website that's more focused on youth sports, which is a whole nother conversation in conflict. But it's an easy website to remember, which is gohelpsports.com.
GoHelpSports.com. And they can connect with you through there.
Through there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you want to learn more about MYJO and what we're doing as part of the MYJO Experience, go to joinmyjo.com, and you can follow us on all of our social channels at MYJOXP. Again, Ruth, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom with us, and hopefully your journey will be a little bit easier being able to negotiate and facilitate meetings and conflicts in your life. I know I gleaned a lot from this, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. Until next time, we'll see you later.